So welcome back to our Bible study. This is the study for Tuesday, May the 5th. As we begin back, we have gotten to the 6th chapter of Matthew, chapter 16. Again, we're still in the Sermon on the Mount. So thank you for sticking with me through this time. As of now, the stay-home order for North Carolina is scheduled to be lifted on Friday. That doesn't mean everything just goes back to normal. So we are still on the plans of figuring out when and how we can gather in person again. I would just caution everybody to know that we are going to err on the side of caution. So I ask for your patience. We want to make sure we keep everyone perfectly safe as we possibly can as we figure this out moving forward. I'm sure when we do get back on site, it's going to be different. We're working on those plans now, and when we have those plans, we will certainly communicate them to you. But for today, we know what we're doing, which is looking at the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. And so let's pray. Lord, help us to hear your word. Help us to understand your word. Help us to learn from your word. In the name of Christ, I pray. Amen. So we got through the Lord's Prayer last week. And if you remember, one of the things that's important to God, as expressed through Jesus, is that we forgive as we are forgiven. That's where we end up the Lord's Prayer, this idea that, hey, you have received a lot from God, therefore you should be willing to pass it on to others, that God's grace doesn't stop with us. We should never be the bottleneck for God's grace. We should always be the conduit of God's grace. You wouldn't want the water from a hose that the fire department uses trying to get choked down into your own little garden hose at home, would you? So what comes to us from God is in abundance, and we should pass it on to others in abundance. And so now we talk about some other things, starting again, chapter 6, verse 16, which reads, "For whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces so as to show others that they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that your fasting may be seen not by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." This is again a continuation from previous verses where Jesus talked about how the Pharisees prayed, which was for show. Again, this is to reemphasize your religious acts are for God. They're not to put on a show for somebody else. And that's something we can easily get into, putting on a show for other people. We don't put on the show of outward religiosity. Put on an inward heart of pleasing God. Do what you do for God, not to be seen by other people or to win the approval of other people. That's what it is. It's very simple. It's very straightforward because it follows up on that theme that Jesus had set earlier in chapter 6 of beware of practicing your piety before others. It's a good teaching technique. Jesus comes back and reinforces that point. Then we go on in 6:19. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So this is one of Jesus's most famous teachings. I remember these verses. They were actually the verses I used to preach the first sermon I ever preached in my entire life. I think I was 18 years old, and it was back at the little church I grew up in. And it was these verses that I used to preach on. I had worked out an entire sermon around this. I thought it was going to be, 20 minutes or so. I was ready to go. I stood up there, and even though everybody I was standing in front of, all maybe 65 of them, were family and friends, people who had watched me grow up, I was so nervous. I think the entire sermon took about 6 minutes. And then I sat down and everybody looked around like, is he done? And then there was a retired pastor in that congregation who, his name was Steve Clark, and I'll never forget what he had to say. He stood up And he said, well, I'd just like to say something. It was that kind of church where just about anybody could stand up and say something, especially if you were a retired pastor. And so Steve Clark stood up and he said, you know, when I was starting out, I was told to remember 3 things whenever you preach. First one is stand up. The second is speak up. And the third one is shut up. And I think our brother Steve there has done that well today. So I'll never forget that day. And I've always carried that preaching lesson with me. Stand up, speak up, and then shut up. But as far as these verses go, they're very straightforward. What do you ultimately value? Is it the things that are incorruptible, as Paul would say, things that can't rot, rust, or go away? Are you investing your life in things that will last forever? Or are you investing your life into things that will go away? You know the old sayings, they don't put trailer hitches on hearses because you can't attach a U-Haul to them, that you can't take it with you. We all know that, right? But yet, how much of our life, how much of our energy, how much of our time is poured into material things? How much do we invest in those things? Things that will ultimately go away. One of the truths I have seen over my time in ministry and just in life in general is that everything eventually falls backwards in value, almost everything anyway, unless it's a great work of art that accrues value, or I guess gold will accrue value. But so much of what we work for, it begins to decline. You know, when the story, you buy a new car, you drive it off the lot, it's immediately worth less because of the depreciation. And so, yet we still invest in those things of status. It seems like everything we have will eventually end up in a yard sale. Everything we have will eventually end up in a yard sale. Unless it's really good stuff, then maybe it ends up in an estate sale. And so why do we work so hard investing in things that will eventually be worthless? And many of those things are even worthless to us. During this time of quarantine, maybe you've done some of the things that Marcy and I have done, and which is go through your closets, go through your drawers, go through your storage to clean out. We have so much stuff that we are going to be taking to the Habitat for Humanity restore. I imagine they're going to be flooded. Goodwill's going to be flooded. The Salvation Army is going to be flooded as people have had time to sit around at their homes and get rid of the stuff they just don't need. And some of the things that have ended up in that pile we thought we really needed. Well, when you take a hard look at them, evidently we didn't really need them. Otherwise, they wouldn't end up in the pile of junk in the garage that's going to be donated. And so what Jesus is asking us is, what do you really value? What do you truly pursue in life? Are you pursuing things that have eternal value, kingdom value? Is what he's talking about. Because the things that are valuable in the kingdom are the things that are valuable in this world too. They still have value. Things like relationship and trust, love, grace, generosity. Love has value here that translates into the next life. One image for me for this comes to me from Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol. Maybe you remember that story. If you've never read it, you've probably seen one of the movies about A Christmas Carol, and so you know the concept. Ebenezer Scrooge, who's greedy and mean and ruthless, and all he cares about are resources, right? The money he has. Meanwhile, he's in a miserable, lonely existence. But what he values are things that will eventually completely go away. What's interesting to me, especially in that work of literature and in the movies that come from it, is the person of Marley's ghost. Do you remember that character? Marley is the first ghost that shows up, kind of his concierge through the night of ghosts, the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. But Marley shows up. Marley was his business partner who had died years before. And you remember when Marley comes, what he's dragging with him? He has this huge chain that's made up of lock boxes and ledgers. Basically, all the things that he thought were valuable in his real life, in his, I hate to use even that word, real life is with Christ, but in his life as he knew it as a businessman, all the things he valued, his calendars, his ledgers, his lock boxes, his possessions, they all are formed together and yoked together to form this big, huge, oppressive chain that he must carry through eternity. In other words, the things that he valued in his life on earth become present with him in his life after he finishes living his life on earth. And so what he values is carried with him. And what he thought was giving him life actually ends up being an oppression to him. And so I love that image because Marley's ghost is a warning to us of what really matters. What do you really value? Is it life-giving or is it life-draining? And how many of us pursue things that take our entire lives and yet will eventually have no value whatsoever? Jesus is telling us, look, work for that which matters. Put your energy into that which matters. One of the things I encourage all of us to do, me included, because I can't say this out loud without it reflecting back to me, is to invest in relationships, especially at a time like this, during times of radical change and times when we don't know the future very well. Then relationships become that much important. Is there somebody you need to call, somebody you need to reach out to, somebody who's on your heart and mind? They're probably on your heart and mind for a reason so that you can connect with them. Invest in those relationships. Invest in your faith in God. Now's a great time to spend some time in prayer. Spend some time in the Bible. Spend some time connecting that way. Those are the things Jesus is talking about. If you have a little extra, give a little extra so others can have. Those are the kinds of things Jesus is talking about. Because what he's saying is really what matters is what is at the heart of us. And why would you put what is so valuable, that of you, which you always carry with you, why would you wrap it up into something that can be so easily destroyed? And it's a message that needed to be heard in the first century, and it's a message that needs to be heard just as drastically in this century. So thank you for joining me today. We're going to wrap up for now, and we'll start back tomorrow. God bless you. Thanks.